So, in Canada, obviously, first of all, language is a federal and a provincial competence. So we have 10 provinces, and we have the federal state. So it's part of the Canadian Constitution. We have an Official Languages Act as well. But within the Constitution, we do have French and English that are of equal status for federal offices, not in the private sphere, only for federal offices. And within provinces, each province can decide on their own what to do with French and English. In Ontario, since 1986, we have passed unanimously, the Legislative Assembly passed unanimously in 86, a French Language Services Act. But in say, New Brunswick, there's an Official Languages Act since 1969. It was actually passed before the federal one, from only a few months. French composes about 24% of the total population of the country. Here in Ontario, it's 600,000 people out of 13 million, so it's about 4.8%, though the federal statistics are different than the Ontario statistics because in Ontario since 2009, we have a new inclusive definition of Francophone, which is very interesting because now a person that comes from, say, Morocco or Algeria that speaks Arabic at home but does speak French and sends the kids to French school, live outside, when they go outside on the street, they are Francophone. Now in Ontario, they are recognized as such. They're not just allophone, they're actually Francophones because they are participating in the Francophone community. With the federal census, they don't qualify as Francophone. They qualify as allophone, which is you're not speaking French nor English at home, so you're something else. I think Ontario is more on the lead on this one because we have a new inclusive definition, and actually I'm very proud of this because it was the first recommendation I ever made when I was appointed commissioner in Ontario. So I'm the equivalent of the federal commissioner of official languages, Graham Fraser, but for the province of Ontario. And there is so my job and my office of 6 people, we're a very small office, only 6, we are dealing with complaints. We receive about 1 complaint per day regarding lack of services. It can be very trivial, but it can be also very personal, and it can be very wide. Give you an example. For instance, it could be documents that are not on the internet at the same time or the same quality in French or in English, or communication from the government that is not in both languages, so from the Ontario government. So that's something that is somewhat easily dealt with, but it can be more personal level. Say, for instance, that someone does not have access because the courts have ordered an individual to have access to his children only through a supervised center. When the supervised center tells the person, you will speak in English to your children because we do not understand French, and you'll sign a contract to that effect. And the person calls us and says, well, my child is only 2-year-old, and that child doesn't speak any other language than French. Of course, that's something that we try to settle the issue immediately. We put all of our resources on that matter. It can be someone, like last week, someone that phoned from Kirkland Lake Hospital, because that's a small town in northern Ontario, because her husband was not able to understand any of the education made by staff regarding treatment. And they weren't, let's try to put it gently, they weren't proactively making comments, proactively offering services in French, quite the contrary, actually. And for many Francophones, actually, we've all heard, and I'm sorry, I spoke French all, for the last 2 days, Usually by Wednesday, my English is so fluid, I'm like that. But this is Sunday night, you'll have to give me a chance. I'm sorry about that. I assure you my English is quite fluid. Not now, but... And I didn't get the memo about the formal dress code, so... I go with the tie. We've all, as Francophones, heard the phrase, sorry, I don't speak French. But we've all heard it with many tones. It happens once that, there's a world of difference between, sorry, I don't speak French, let me get someone that does speak French right to you, it'll be a few minutes more, no worries. Or, as it happened to me many, many times, I go behind the counter and for the signs, English, Français, and then I go and wait in line for that. And then I arrive at the counter and I speak French. The other person, I don't speak French. Okay, well, how come there's a sign? I waited for this one. That sign? Bang. See, that's not active offer. That sends me that I'm not equal. And actually, it's interesting because when you're looking at the purpose of an Official Languages Act or the French Language Services Act, and just some of you asked me the difference. What is the difference between the two? As former Supreme Court Justice of Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada explained in these terms that the difference between an Official Languages Act is the minority that imposes its equality of status to the majority, whereas a French Language Services Act is the majority that allow its minority to receive some protection. Now, I don't entirely agree with this one because Francophones have been in Ontario for the last 400 years, so it's nothing compared to the millennia of First Nations, but still, it's a pretty long time as well. We've helped establish Toronto, Windsor, actually, mostly Windsor, and then the north and the east, obviously. So the equality is very interesting because when you're looking at the purpose of the French Language Services Act, it's the Court of Appeal in Montfort, actually, clearly stated that first, it's a quasi-constitutional act, which means that it's an act above all the other acts of the provincial legislative assembly, such as the Ontario Human Rights Act as well, or the Information and Protection of Privacy Act. When you're looking at it, the purpose is to protect and preserve the Francophone minority in Ontario, but it's also to achieve the equality of status. Now, when you're looking at the equality of status, there's I'll just give you an example of how the courts, because this is something that may interest you, and perhaps you as well, the courts, the notion of equality and language is something that the courts has been struggling with since the beginning of the implementation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom in 1982. In 1986, actually, there was a 3 cases, we call it the trilogy, and there's a section 19, which prescribes that you can have access to courts, to federal courts, all over the country, in both French or in English. And it's the same wording in New Brunswick. So there was a case coming from New Brunswick, and that people were seeking to have to be heard in French in front of a judge. And it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And Justice Betts at the time wrote for the majority with a strong dissent by Chief Justice Dixon. But he wrote for the majority that Francophones, yes, you do have access to the courts in French. You can be heard in French to the courts, but it doesn't give you the right to be understood. I'm not kidding. I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. So people were like, I'm sorry, say what? Yeah, you can have the right to be understood by the judge, but it doesn't give you the right to be understood. So everyone was taken aback by this decision of the Supreme Court of the most highest court of the land.
When was it?
In 1986. It was called the restrictive theory of and I'll just get into that notion because it's very, well, I think it's relevant. But after that decision, that landmark decision, there was such an uproar that the criminal code was changed to say that you have the right to be heard and understood by the courts. The Official Languages Act was amended in 1988 to say clearly that you have the right to be heard and understood by a judge. Now,
does that mean you only have to be heard if you're charged as a criminal under the criminal code?
Yes. Yes. Unless now in Ontario, since 1984, you have the French and English are the official languages of the courts in Ontario. So being an official language solves a little bit, well, we thought we solved the issue with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, but in any event, that's a fairly good question, though in Ontario, every justice is understand that, I hope, that you have the right to be heard and understood in the courts of Ontario. Now, this restrictive approach was done because Justice Betts said that unlike other Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, say language of expression, speech, freedom of speech, vote, unlike all the other aspects of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, language rights are they're coming from a political compromise. So because of that, we need to be careful as judges on how we implement them. So we need to be very careful to give life to language rights because they are coming from a political compromise. Now that was very interesting. It was called a restrictive approach because obviously it was called a restrictive approach by Francophones advocates, I guess. And the Supreme Court of Canada tried to distance itself from that landmark decision from day one. And finally, in Boileau case in 1989, they finally reversed completely that. They said the court, the majority, not the majority, it was unanimous at that decision, in the Boileau decision. The restrictive approach needs to be thrown away. It was quite clear because it didn't work. It didn't work. It sent the wrong signal. Now the equality is the norm, and the court said, by the way, every other rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom are also coming from a political compromise basis. So language rights are no different. So now they said that equality, this might be interesting, equality is not the formal equality, but substantive equality. The difference between the two is that a formal equality is that everyone is treated in the same fashion, in the same way. So everyone, say, for example, have access to the train. Everyone can buy a ticket, everyone can have access to the train. That's formal equality. But if you don't have an access ramp, for those of us who are in wheelchair, for instance, they don't have a real access. They cannot access the train. So we need a substantive equality approach. We need to put an access ramp to those who need to access the train. So that's the big difference. And the court said, in language rights, we need the same approach. So it's to have say for example, schools. We have a right to receive education at elementary and secondary levels throughout the country in both French and English. And say that because the numbers are very small, for example, in Saskatchewan, Francophones, it will cost more money to have schools because they don't have the same base. But that's substantive equality. We need to allow the Francophone community to have schools, even if they don't have the same per capita basis to go. So that's substantive equality. That's something am I okay? That's something we've achieved. But it's also so we've come a great deal with that Boileau landmark case. But somehow it lingers on.